Good morning. I'm just going to analyse a master game. On the white side is Marcel Duchamp, and on the white side is Edgar Colley. I think Colley was maybe Belgium, and the game was played in a Belgian tournament. Marcel Duchamp was a very interesting character. He was an artist, and he was one of the powerful influencers and starters of the Dada movement, which later became the Surrealist movement. And he did do Surrealist and Dada art. He began painting in his parents' garden at a very young age, 3 or 4 years old, and was a good painter. And yeah, but that's probably not what he's most famous for within art. What he's most famous for, typically controversial. There was lots of controversy and heated discussion about art in the early to mid parts of the last century. And Duchamp took a urinal toilet and signed it with his name and hung it up in an art gallery and said, "It's art because I say it's art," which, it caused even more controversy, and you can argue both for and against it. Not really going to get into that, but yeah, okay. I think if an artist says it's art, then it's probably art. What do I know? I'm not an artist. What do I know about it? But, I would look at if I went to the gallery, I know myself that I would look at it and say somebody has hung up a toilet there. You know, but I have to respect that if he says it's art, it's art. I have to respect that. I don't have to like the art. I don't have to agree with it hanging up in the gallery, but I have to respect his opinion that it's art. That's what I think anyway. Anyway, he more or less gave up art eventually to devote himself to his other passion in life, which had always been chess. He decided at a older age, in his 20s, I think, that he would become the best chess player he could be, and he became a decent chess player. He played for France in the Olympiads, and he played many times in the French Championship, and maybe could have won it on one occasion. Lost in a winning position in the last but one round. Yeah, so a good player. Edgar Colley, famous for the Colley Zukertort attack, of course. Excuse me. So let's just see what happens. So, white plays d4, very standard. Knight f6, the Indian game. c4, yeah, very standard. Old Indian defense with d6 rather than e6. But you could also call it a Pirch defense. Uh, you know, but in the Pirch defense, usually white has played e4, so not d4. So, Old Indian defence. This looks a bit like a type of accelerated London system, but in a London system, you'd expect that this pawn had been moved here and not this pawn, and then this bishop would have a more active diagonal. Here it's already like it's biting on granite, so you know. But it does stop black's intention of playing e5, because then you can take it with a pawn. If he takes back, then you get the queen. He gets the queen, but then the bishop wins the pawn, so it does stop that intention. But black answers in kind with going to a more open diagonal, probably with the intention of playing his knight to here to support e5, to b7 to support e5. Can't play to c6 to support e5 because it would just get chased away by d5. If he plays to c6, just get chased away by d5, and white would have a permanent space advantage in the centre. d5 is actually possible now to try and take that space advantage, but yeah, e6 is probably going to break it down anyway. So, very modern looking queen b3. And now he can either come back with his bishop, or he could actually come here with his bishop to defend, but then if he comes here to defend the b2 pawn, if he comes here, then the pawn is going to come here, and then the bishop would have to go here, and then the pawn is going to have to come here, so it can't defend. So there's three choices to defend the pawn. He can play the bishop back where it came from, a waste of a tempo. He can play pawn to b6, but then he's fianchettoed and his bishop isn't there. That has got to be a weakening of his position, and of course when you play then pawn to d5, that's even stronger if the move b6 is played. So he chooses queen c8. Not the ideal place for either queen actually, but I like white's queen a little bit more than black's. So c3, with 2 points behind c3, it supports the square e4, where he eventually hopes to get his pawn, and it also prevents bishop takes the knight on b1. Normally we're not so keen on swapping a bishop for a knight, but in this case this bishop is fairly useless and this knight is fairly active, so it may have made sense for him to get rid of that. So Duchamp kills 2 birds with 1 stone. As I said, he's no threatening to, the knight comes here, so he's no threatening to play d5, e5. But of course it takes away that retreat from the bishop, so you know that might prove to be a factor. But knight to f3, 2 things: it develops and it attacks also the important e5 square, making it again not possible for black to play e5. Yeah, h6 and h3. Normally I'm not too keen on these little pawn moves at the side, but sometimes it has a good purpose. Yeah, and they both have the same purpose with this move. Both can play their knight to the rim, here and here, to attack the bishops here and here. And if the pawn wasn't moved, then the bishop could only retreat here or here, and then it's still threatened by the knight. If the white bishop comes here, it just gets chased, as I described before, and runs out of places. So he's making a space for his bishop. So yeah, it's understandable. It's understandable. So black plays c5. You've got to try and make some expansion in the centre, and in Sicilian style, you're making an attack on d4. It makes sense. White supports the pawn on d4 and also allows his bishop to come into the game. 2 birds with 1 stone again. I really dislike this move from black. I think if you're playing g5, or for that sake g4, then okay, if you're gonna force that bishop off, it might be worth it. But here the bishop has got the retreat square already, and white hasn't committed himself to queenside castling. It's kingside castling, whereas black more or less has committed himself to castling on the short side, and he's now weakened his position on the king side. So I don't like the move. Really don't like the move. Of course, Duchamp just retreats his bishop, and the bishop comes to g7. A powerful diagonal, ready for castling. Now the knight comes to e4, d2 to support e4. Not quite ready to push e4 yet because the pawn on d4 is undefended. Black retreats because maybe he could have got away with that d4 because it would have been an attack on the bishop, so it gives him a tempo. And now White does 2 things with this move, 3 things. He creates the pawn chain. 4 things, he locks the centre partly. It means that the pawn on d5 is no longer threatened. The pawn on d4 is no longer threatened, and it makes e4 now possible because it's supported by 2 knights and attacked by a knight and a bishop, so he can play d4 when he wants to. And White's castle, so it makes this move, this pawn chain, even more ridiculous because he castled. And so, as advertised, he plays e4. Yeah, he can maybe think about playing c3. He might f3. He might play f4 at some point, but he can think about creating a bigger pawn chain. But yeah, and now Black plays the knight to e8. Knight on e8. There is no mate, but there is no mating attack at the minute. And the point with knight to e8 is that he wants to free up the f pawn so they can move the f pawn. And so you could routinely just castle and then f5 is going to come immediately. But instead, Duchamp plays f4. Excellent, really approve of this move, which points out what's wrong. One of the things which is wrong with playing this move. Often in opposite sides castling games, which this is, even although White hasn't technically castled yet, then the person who throws the first punch wins, and by making contact with the opposition army, first contact is made, the first blow is thrown. This has got to favour Duchamp, and Colour really can't afford to not take it and have a line opened anyway. This is the point with contact, that you're going to either open this line or you're going to open this line, the F or the G file. Well, takes the bishop and now puts pressure on the h6 pawn, meaning the bishop has to stay there. It's been given a job now. It's got to guard the h6 pawn. f5. This comes with a threat that when the pawn moves, takes the pawn on e5, then the rook attacks the bishop. So he has to take account of this threat in everything he does. So he takes the pawn, so that White can't take. All right, he's now left with a very short pawn chain, and this pawn will be free to expand and attack White's centre later. But also this pawn becomes weak with this move. Now, he could think about taking with the rook to attack the bishop, but then he's got his rook and bishop in the wrong order. And when the bishop moves, here for example, maybe here, then bishop can come to d3, attack the rook and attack behind at the pawn, the bishop, and strip away defenders from the king. So, he plays his bishop. And White retreats to e2 to defend the bishop. Otherwise, he may have been threatening to play bishop takes pawn and then rook takes bishop, winning a pawn. Won't work now. So, the knight comes to e4, e5 even. I'm not sure why. I suppose it restrains the queen because the queen has to contribute to taking hold of this pawn, and I suppose that knight here check is a threatening check. Yeah, so he just gets rid of it. Doesn't want it. He doesn't want a piece that advanced, and now he is free to advance the g pawn, and that's what he does. Now, before I was complaining about when White done this. Is it when Black done this? Is it any better when Duchamp does it? Yeah, because they, you're attacking a piece immediately. It has to retreat, and you're also threatening g5 and ripping up in a line. Is it going to work to sacrifice on g4? Bishop takes, knight takes, queen takes. No, it's not going to work because the rook can come to b1 and pin the queen to the king. Won't do any good. The bishop coming to g3 because the rook or the queen could take it. The queen obviously is the correct. The rook obviously is the correct piece, and then you get a queen for a rook as well as a free piece. So he can't afford the sacrifice there. So he has to retreat the bishop. And now g5 is always going to be a threat for black. But, you know, there's a kind of a heuristic, rule of thumb in chess that you don't begin active operations with the king in the centre, because you're just taking too big a risk. So white castles queenside, and we do actually now have an opposite sides castling game. He plays 8x to support b5. Normally you might think, well, he can play b5, he can afford to give away a pawn. But the point is that the pawn would be defended by the queen on b3. And also the c4 square would be available for the knight to defend b2 and to stop further progress. So he has to play a6. But it's a bit slow. Queen to e3, threatening pawn on h6. Black can't let that fall, so he could defend it with the bishop or with the king. He chooses to defend with the king. The problem with this move is that if white ever manages to take the bishop on g6, then the king is brought further out into the board. And usually when the king is brought further out into the board, it's dire consequences for the player whose king is dragged out. So, plays his bishop to support the knight on e4. Yeah. So the attack begins. So, are we in a position now where black has made contact before white? Black has thrown a punch before black? Not really, because, you know, taking it isn't going to do it. It will open up this file eventually, but, you know, white's attack is much more serious. So he threatens to take the rook. Something else to be done about that. So the bishop goes in the way of the threat for the rook. Then that allows the knight to come to f4, where it attacks the bishop on g6, threatening to bring the king out into the game. It's beginning to get serious for Kalahar. There's two purposes with this knight. It's not just transferring the knight to the queen side where he wants to be playing, but it also opens up contact again between the two rooks and in this case the queen. I just noticed that the small pawn chain of c4 and d5 does the things that I've talked about lately about that the pawn chain does in an attack. It holds the centre partially blocked, and it makes it easier for white to transfer pieces from the queen side to the king side, you know, which facilitates the attacking play. But of course he takes there, and now the bishop comes out. If he goes to, he can go to f7 or g7. If he goes to f7, then the bishop is immediately pinned, so the pawn attacks the pinned piece. Yeah, he could take with the pawn, but then you take with the queen, the bishop is still pinned, and you've invited another piece into attack, and it would be threatening mate on g6. So for that reason, he goes to g7. Great. Two purposes. it means that this file is now not as open. You might think he would play bishop here to defend the pawn, but then the pawn takes anyway, and then the bishop has to move here anyway. So he's picked the best square and he's sticking to it. So the queen comes to d8, e8 to defend this square and this square, and also to make it possible, possibly, to transfer the queen from the king side to the queen side via this diagonal. Okay, white's just carrying on. He's going to rip open these lines. Okay, black's managed to rip open a line, and now he's threatening to play queen or rook to b8 and have a battery on b2, which might give some success. I will note just that the knight on d2 and the bishop on c2 both defend the b1 square, making that attack less likely. But yeah, now he attacks the pawn and he attacks the bishop. This has become a hook, and it's even more of a hook in that it's attacking too. Black must react to that. He can't just ignore it. He reacts violently, rips open the line, sacrifices the bishop. Sometimes you would think of hiding behind the bishop rather than taking it, so as not to be as exposed. But in this case, if you hid behind the bishop, the rook or the queen would come to b8 anyway, and the king would be exposed when the bishop moves. So it's just as good to take the bishop. I don't think it really makes much difference which of its king has 4 choices. Obviously, it doesn't want to come here or here, further forward. So we're looking at rook here, king here, or king here. I prefer king here because with these 2 pieces protecting the back rank, it's better to give yourself more choices. And when the knight moves, then your king's got another escape square. So, and that's what Duchamp does. So he pushes past so that the line doesn't get ripped open. Duchamp takes the rook, and when I first looked at the game, I thought that the black's next move was a big mistake. But when I look at it, if he does it the other way, then rook to c1, rook to f1 is just as powerful. So if he takes with the king, rook to f1 is check, and the king has to come back to into the same bunch of problems really. So taking with the queen doesn't make any difference, but it's his last move of the game because Duchamp plays queen to e4, and he's either going to get mate here or mate here. If colour covers the mate here, then he's going to play queen here check. King's going to have to go there, and then queen here check, and then the queen's going to have to come in the way, and then rook here will be mate. And if he comes here or here or here to defend the h7 square, then mate happens on g6, or when the queen moves he does then have f8, but then the rook comes to f1 anyway to complete the mating net. So yeah, actually very thorough, consequent play by Duchamp. He had his ideas and he followed them relentlessly throughout, and all his moves contributed well to the ideas he had. But a bit too many weakening moves from colour. So what can we learn from this? Well, we can learn that it's possible to excel in more than one field, that one can come to serious chess at an older age and still achieve good things. Yeah. Which reminds me, excelling in 2 fields reminds me of Simon Agdestein, the first and oldest grandmaster in Norway, who, as well as being a grandmaster, played football, professionally. Played for Brighton in the Premier League, and he played for Norway. Had a few games for Norway and managed to score 1 goal, which was a decent goal. Yeah, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment. All of these things help me. Yep, okay, thanks. Bye.